Now, the war has also sent jet fuel prices sky high, and that may end up being the final nail in the coffin for Spirit Airlines. The airline's operating certificate requires infrastructure to operate and to move. And so our job has been to take aircraft back from Spirit Airlines after they had ceased operation. In a single night, Spirit Airlines parked over 120 airplanes and then switched off the lights for good. Welcome to Enigma Expedition.
Picture it. Row after row of bright yellow jets sitting dark and silent at airports across the country, each one worth more than most people earn in a lifetime, and every single one suddenly belonging to no one. The airline that flew them is finished, but the jets did not vanish. Right now, something is quietly happening to all 120 of them.
Something almost nobody is talking about. So what really happens to 120 grounded airplanes? Now, Spirit Airlines is going out of business. The airline said early this morning that it has begun shutting down operations. It's also canceled all upcoming flights. The answer is stranger than anyone expects. The treasure chest. At 3 o'clock in the morning on May 2nd, 2026, an entire airline stopped existing. Not slowed down, not shrank, stopped. The last flights landed. The crews walked off for the final time. And rows of bright yellow jets went dark on tarmacs across the country. Every one of them worth more than most people will earn in a lifetime, and all of them going nowhere. Spirit did not file the kind of bankruptcy a company crawls back from. There are two kinds, and this was the worst one. The first kind is a company in trouble buying itself time to reorganize and survive. This was the second kind. Liquidation, a full shutdown with the courts selling off everything Spirit owned piece by piece to pay back the people it owed. And the 3 a.m. timing was no accident. It was chosen on purpose so that every jet was already on the ground and every crew member safely accounted for before the first traveler woke up to learn their flight had been cancelled. Spirit Airlines was very successful in driving down fares in many markets. The larger competitors, the Uniteds of the industry, were trying to compete with them, and it sparked fare wars and ultimately for consumers looking for cheap flights. It was great. Then the country woke up. Travelers reached airports from Fort Lauderdale to New York and found the yellow counters dark and the screens above them blank. The phone lines were dead. The website was down. The company was simply gone. Picture a parent who had booked one cheap seat to reach a child's graduation. Or a worker who had finally gotten a rare weekend off, standing at a gate, refreshing a dead app, waiting for a flight that would never be called. Millions of plans evaporated in a single night. And just like that, Spirit became the first major American airline in a generation to collapse this way. So how does an airline that size simply die? The whole model had always run on one thing: cheap fuel. The bare fare, the cheapest seat in the sky, the ticket that let people who could never normally afford to fly finally get on a plane, only worked if the fuel stayed cheap. So when war with Iran drove jet fuel up by roughly 70%, it hit Spirit exactly where it could not survive being hit. The airline burned through about $100 million on fuel in just 2 months. A $500 million government bailout was supposed to be the lifeline, the thing that kept the lights on, but the lenders read the numbers, weighed the risk, and walked away. And this was not even Spirit's first brush with death. It was the second bankruptcy in a single year. Well, they liquidate, meaning they cease to operate. Their tickets are no longer valid. They will not be accepted by any other airline without a substantial fare difference. And at that point, whatever assets they have left get auctioned off by a conservator. In the month before the end, the airline had already been quietly dismantling itself to stay alive, handing planes back to their owners and shrinking its fleet from more than 200 jets toward roughly half that. From the outside, the collapse looked like it happened in one night. On the inside, Spirit had been dying in slow motion, and anyone who knew where to look had seen it coming. But here's the strange part. A dead airline can still be worth a staggering amount. When the court added it all up, Spirit's planes and engines were valued at around $13 billion. There was another $167 million sitting in spare parts. The takeoff and landing slots at a single New York airport were worth close to $87 million on their own. Just the right to land and leave. The airline was finished, but its bones were valuable, and everyone Spirit owed money to was already forming the line to pick at them. There was just one problem with that line. By the end, Spirit was so broke it told the court there was no money left to even hold a proper auction. And no auction changed everything because it meant the real owners of most of those planes did not have to wait or bid or compete with anyone at all. They could simply show up and take them. Most passengers have never heard of the law that let them do exactly that. And it is the entire reason most of these jets were already slipping out of Spirit's hands, before the court could even finish counting them. The 60-day clock, the law sounds boring. It is anything but. And once you understand it, you will never look at a boarding gate the same way again. When an airline fails, the companies that lease it, planes are handed a 60-day window to decide what to do. And if the airline cannot pay, those owners have the legal right to walk straight onto the ramp and take their jets back. But transporting one of these aircraft to the desert isn't simple. A representative of the FAA must first inspect the aircraft and then issue a permit to guarantee the airplane's airworthiness. And then there's everything from staffing to fuel to take care of. No standing in line behind other creditors, no months lost in court. They take the keys, and they leave. Why would the law work that way? The reasoning is simple, and it comes down to one thing. A plane can run. You cannot repossess a hotel in an afternoon. You cannot drive off with an office tower. But a jet can be inspected, started, taxied to a runway, and flown to another country before the sun goes down. Because the asset has wheels and wings and is worth millions of dollars, the law lets the owner grab it back fast before all the value bleeds away sitting on the ground. There is a logic to it that is almost cold. A grounded jet is not just sitting still. It is actively losing money every hour, gathering parking fees. Drifting toward the day it will need expensive checks just to be legal to fly again. The faster an owner can reclaim it, clean it up, and place it with a new airline, the more of that $13 billion pile survives. So the law does not ask the owners to be patient. It hands them a key and a deadline. Here is the part you never think about as you shuffle down the jet bridge with your bag. The airline, whose name is painted in giant letters down the side, usually does not own the plane you're about to sit in. Spirit owned barely any of its jets. Roughly 2 out of every 3 were leased from companies most travelers have never heard of. Firms with names like AirCap, Sky Leasing, SMBC, and Carl. Many of them based in Dublin of all places. These companies do not fly passengers. They do not run check-in counters. They buy planes by the dozen and rent them out to airlines. The same basic way a landlord buys an apartment building and rents out the units. It is an arrangement almost every airline on Earth relies on because a single new jet can cost more than a carrier earns in a year. And leasing lets an airline fly a fleet it could never afford to buy outright. The struggling budget airline could shut down as soon as Saturday, barring a last-minute intervention. The catch is the one nobody thinks about until a day like this. When the airline gets into trouble, it does not actually own most of the expensive machines it flies. Those planes belong to someone else, and that someone else is allowed to come and collect. So when Spirit collapsed, it did not just owe money to banks and workers. It owed planes back to landlords. AirCap alone was owed more than $500 million. AirCap and Ski Leasing each held the leases on about 10 of the jets. Another 8 were tied to SMBC, and a long tail of smaller firms split the rest among themselves. The moment the airline went dark, every one of them started the same 60-day clock, and every one of them wanted their property back before it lost a cent, so they moved and they moved fast. This was a genuine scramble, not a quiet paperwork shuffle in some office. Teams of inspectors, engineers, and pilots fanned out to the 26 airports where the bright yellow jets sat stranded, racing the clock and racing each other because every single day a grounded plane sits unused. It loses value and racks up fees. The planes had to be checked, claimed, and flown out and quickly. But you cannot hand that job to just anyone with a pilot's license. The only people who could safely move these exact planes, who knew every switch, every quirk, every habit of these exact cockpits, were the very people Spirit had just thrown out of work. If you are the kind of person who finds it impossible to look away once a story turns into this, the channel runs on exactly that instinct. So take a second to subscribe and follow these planes with us because where they go next is even stranger than where they have been. Now back to the people who had to fly them there. Flying their own funeral. A company called Optic Aviation was hired to move the fleet. And to actually fly the planes out, they reached for the one group of people on Earth who knew those cockpits by heart. Spirit asked for $500 million government bailout. President Trump said the government gave Spirit a final proposal. To understand why that is so heavy, you have to understand what had just happened to them. 17,000 people lost their jobs the night the airline died, and most of them were not pilots at all. Flight attendants, gate agents, baggage handlers, mechanics, schedulers, the whole invisible machine that keeps an airline running. All of them woke up to the same uncertain morning. And the pilots faced something specific and brutal. Seniority does not carry between airlines, it does not transfer. So even a captain with decades in the left seat, someone who had spent an entire career climbing the ladder, would have to start over at the very bottom somewhere new. If there even was a somewhere new. The mortgages built on those paychecks did not stop. The children who depended on that income did not stop needing things, only the income stopped. And now a small handful of those same pilots were being paid one flight at a time to fly the planes they used to crew out into the desert where most would be stored or taken apart. To Bob Allen, the man who runs Nomadic, it was a death in the family. The work was a small mercy, he said. A way to put a little money into the pockets of people who had just lost everything and a way to give them something harder to name. Some of them, he understood, simply needed closure. Picture sitting in that cockpit one last time, the same seat, the same checklist you could recite in your sleep, the same plane you flew full of passengers just a week ago. Except now the cabin behind you is empty and silent. No boarding announcements, no seatbelt chimes, no one back there at all. And you know that when you shut the engines down at the end of this flight, you will almost certainly never fly this aircraft again. For a lot of these pilots, that quiet, empty trip across the country was the only goodbye they ever got. Adam Giordano was at the center of it, moving more than 20 of these jets in a single week, flying them from airports across the map out to the Arizona desert, including one he flew himself, an empty Spirit plane taken all the way from Philadelphia to Mo i Rana. He was so buried in the work that one day he simply forgot to eat. Think about the choreography that takes. Dozens of jets scattered across the country, each one needing the right crew, the right paperwork, a clear slot to take off, and somewhere to land at the other end. Before any of them could leave, somebody had to climb aboard each plane and confirm it was the right one. Read the logbooks, check the engine hours, and make sure the jet owner was about to fly away actually matched the one on their paperwork. Get that wrong, and you have just flown off with someone else's multi-million-dollar asset. In the first frantic days, the crews were spread across several airports at once, moving planes faster than most people on the ground could keep track of. Some of these jets were still in the sky days after Spirit had officially ceased to exist, crossing the country under brand new flight numbers that no longer belonged to any living airline. Controllers found themselves clearing flights for an airline that on paper had already stopped existing. If you happened to look up that week and saw a bright yellow plane passing overhead with empty windows, you were watching the end of an airline at 35,000 feet, and every one of those final flights was pointed at the same place. A place that from the outside looks an awful lot like a graveyard where planes sleep. The yellow jets came down in Arizona at two airfields named Goodyear and Pino Air Park. People call places like these boneyards, and the name makes a grim kind of sense the first time you see one. Rows and rows of grounded planes baking in the sun, lined up nose to tail, stretching as far as the eye can follow. There are hundreds of them out there from airlines all over the world. And at a glance, every single one looks dead or abandoned. Some of them belong to airlines that no longer exist. Some are waiting out a slow patch in the market, parked by carriers that fully intend to fly them again the moment demand returns. Some are nearly new jets delivered into a world that suddenly did not need them yet. The desert holds all of it at once, the dead and the merely resting, side by side in the same rows. And from the highway you cannot tell which is which. That is what makes a boneyard such a strange place to stand in. It is not quite a junkyard, and it is not quite a museum. It is something in between, a vast parking lot where multi-million-dollar machines wait out the gap between one life and the next. Some for a few months, some for a few years, a rare few forever. The bright yellow Spirit jets, all 120 of them, had just joined the back of that long line. But the name is wrong because most of these planes are not here to die. They are here for very practical reasons. The bone-dry desert air slows the corrosion that can quietly eat a plane apart from the inside out. The land is flat, open, and cheap with room to spare. There are fewer birds and fewer insects to crawl into engines and nest in the systems. Pino Air Park alone sprawls across more than 2,000 acres of open desert about 90 meters outside Phoenix, with room to swallow whole fleets at once. Walk the rows out there and the only sounds are the wind and the soft tick of metal, slowly cooling in the afternoon heat. Storing a plane, though, is nothing like parking a car in a garage. It is closer to embalming a body you fully intend to bring back to life. If fuel is left sitting in the tanks, bacteria take hold and turn it into a thick sludge, so every tank has to be drained and cleaned. The tires get wrapped in reflective film to shield them from the brutal desert sun. Every engine opening gets sealed to keep animals from moving in. Some planes are coated entirely to bounce the sunlight away. Careful records are kept of exactly what was done and when, so that whoever wakes the plane up later knows precisely how long it slept and what it will need. To the tourists who drive out to gawk at the rows, it looks like the end of the road for these machines. To the people who actually work the field, every tail number is inventory, an asset on someone's books. A plane that is one phone call away from flying again. And even with all of that care, it still costs around $5,000 a month just to keep one plane parked and doing nothing. Done right, a jet put to sleep this carefully can be woken up and flying again, within weeks. Done wrong, the very same plane can be ruined in a single desert season. The difference between those two outcomes is just patient, unglamorous work in 100 heat. And the crews treat every tail number like it has a future because most of them do. That is exactly why nobody wants these jets sitting idle for long, and they will not be. Because tucked under the wing of each one of those yellow planes is the single most valuable thing Spirit left behind. And right now the entire industry is desperate to get its hands on it. Engines worth more. For years, the modern engines bolted under planes like Spirit's built by Pratt & Whitney have carried a hidden flaw. They wear out and need major overhauls far sooner than anyone expected when they were designed. And when one of them breaks, the repair does not take days or weeks. It can take close to a year simply because so many airlines around the world are stuck waiting in the very same line for the very same fix. There is no quick way around it. You cannot build new engines overnight because the factories and repair shops that handle them can only move so fast. And they were already running flat out. So the line just keeps getting longer and every airline in it waits its turn while its planes sit on the ground, earning nothing. A grounded plane is the most expensive kind of furniture there is. It still has to be insured, parked, inspected, and paid for, and it brings in absolutely nothing. Multiply that by hundreds of jets across dozens of airlines all at the same time, And you start to see how a single missing part the size of a refrigerator can quietly reshape an entire industry. The scale of it is hard to believe. At one point, somewhere around 835 jets fitted with this engine sat grounded worldwide. That is nearly 4 out of every 10 ever built with it, parked, idle, going nowhere, all for one reason. They needed working engines and could not get them. In India, one budget airline had more than 60 of these jets sitting on the ground at the same time. In Europe, another had over 40. This is not just a number on a spreadsheet somewhere. It is the reason carriers from India to Europe have parked perfectly good planes, axed routes that whole towns depended on for their only air service, and sent crews home. All because there are simply not enough engines to go around. For the passenger, it shows up as a flight that quietly disappears from the schedule. A route that used to exist and suddenly does not. A fare that creeps higher because there are fewer seats to sell. Almost none of them ever learn that. The reason traces all the way back to a defect in a part, bolted under a wing they never once thought about. When something everyone needs becomes something almost no one can get, the price does exactly what you would expect. A single one of these engines can sell for around $20 million. And a working pair can be worth more than the entire plane wrapped around them. It is like a house being worth less than the 2 air conditioners bolted to the side of it. In Spain, there are rows of nearly new jets being torn apart right now. Not because anything was wrong with them, but because their engines were simply worth more off the plane than on it. Stop and think about how upside down that is. The most expensive thing about a modern jet is not the wings, not the cockpit full of instruments, not the miles of wiring buried in the frame. It is 2 metal cylinders hanging beneath it, made scarce by a defect and made priceless by a backlog. For a strange window in history, the part that exists to move the plane is worth more than everything it was built to move. And here is the cruel twist in all of this. That very same engine defect is part of what killed Spirit in the first place. At one point, nearly 40 of its own jets sat grounded, waiting on engines, bleeding money while they did absolutely nothing. Planes the airline owned outright and still could not fly. The flaw that helped end the airline is now the exact reason the whole industry is circling its corpse. Still, Spirit's engines alone will not fix the shortage. They will trickle back into the market slowly, and the world needs thousands more than any single airline could ever supply. Which is why the forecasts expect this crunch to drag on for years. Which raises an obvious question. If 2 engines are worth more than the entire plane, why not just strip the engines off all 120 jets, sell them for a fortune, and scrap the rest? The engines do come off first, but the moment they are gone, the stripped body of the plane begins a journey almost no passenger has ever pictured. Second lives. Some of these jets will fly again, looking nearly the same, just dressed in new colors. A full repaint runs somewhere between $50,000 and $200,000 and takes a week or 2 of work. So planes often fly for months with a fresh logo slapped right over the old one, looking for a while like 2 airlines at once. It is one of the quiet truths of air travel that planes change hands far more often than the logos on the tail would ever suggest. A jet can wear 3 or 4 different airlines colors over its life, and the passengers in back never notice because the only thing that really changes is the paint. The frame underneath stays exactly the same, and Spirit's old competitors are already circling. Major airlines like American, United, JetBlue, and Frontier have been eyeing the planes, the airport gates, and those valuable landing slots. Spirit had already sold off some gates at Chicago's busiest airport before the very end came. Now, the rest of what it left behind is being claimed by the very companies it spent 34 years fighting for passengers. And some of Spirit's own pilots and crew will probably end up flying these exact jets for those rivals on the route Spirit used to own. There is a bitter symmetry to that. For 34 years, Spirit dragged fares down and forced the bigger airlines to compete on price, which is the whole reason so many people who could never have afforded to fly suddenly could. Now those same bigger airlines get to quietly pick the bones, absorbing the gates, the slots, the planes, and even the crews. Other jets get a far more dramatic second act. Crews cut a large door into the side of the fuselage, tear out every passenger seat, reinforce the floor to take the weight, and turn the plane into a freighter that can haul more than 20 tons of cargo. The demand for this is so high that the waiting list for that surgery already runs to roughly 320 aircraft worldwide. And it keeps growing as more and more of what people order online gets flown through the night instead of floated across an ocean by ship. It is a strange kind of reincarnation. The plane that once smelled like coffee and recycled air that once filled with safety briefings and crying infants gets gutted down to bare metal and handed over to cardboard boxes. The window's still there, but nobody looking out of them anymore. So the next time an overnight package lands on your doorstep, there's a real chance it rode there in what used to be Spirit Seat 14B. That trade is only growing. Every year, a little more of the world's shopping moves online, and a great deal of it has to arrive fast, which means it flies. So the planes that once carried people to the beach are being quietly drafted into the machine that carries everything those same people order from their couches. And then there are the oldest, most worn-out jets. The ones whose flying days really are finished. These get picked clean. Their landing gear, their cockpit instruments, their power units. Every single working component gets pulled out to keep other planes flying somewhere else in the world. What remains is an empty aluminum shell, and that shell gets cut up and sold for scrap. Even then, a single retired jet can donate hundreds of working parts to the plane still in the air. A pump from one jet keeps another flying over the Atlantic. A valve, a slice of wiring, a seat track, a single window. All of it finds a new home in a plane still carrying passengers. So in a strange way, the scrap jet keeps living through every aircraft it helps keep flying. Some of that leftover metal might even come back to you one day as a soda can. Which brings us right back to the question we started with. If the engines really are worth more than the plane, why do almost all of these jets get a second life instead of the scrapyard? You will never know. The answer comes down to one stubborn fact about aviation that most passengers never learn. A passenger jet is built to last 20 to 30 years, and plenty of them keep flying well past 40. Over that long life, a single plane earns back its value several times over. Passing from one airline to the next, crossing borders and oceans, flying tens of thousands of trips. The airframe itself helps. The A320 family, the kind most of Spirit's jets belong to, is the most produced airliner ever built. More common in the sky than any other jet alive, which means there is always another airline somewhere that needs the frame, and always another shop somewhere that needs its parts. So think about the math the way the owners think about it. A single airframe might be born into one airline's colors, fly for a decade, get sold to a carrier on another continent, fly for them for years, and end up somewhere else entirely after that, all without a single passenger ever realizing the plane had a past life. Strip the engines off a young jet, and you make money exactly once. Keep that same plane flying, and it keeps earning year after year for decades. It is the difference between selling the goose and keeping the eggs. And the people who own these planes did that math a long time ago. An engine sale is a one-time check. A flying airframe is an income stream. And in this business, a steady income beats a single windfall almost every time. Most of Spirit's jets are still young with plenty of life left in them. So the same brutal math that could have ended them is the very thing that keeps them alive, which means the desert is not really a graveyard at all. It is closer to a waiting room. One by one, those bright yellow jets get new paint, new names, and new flags. And then they climb back into the sky and go back to work. Some go to low-cost airlines down in Latin America. Some spend their days hopping between cities across Europe under flags you have never seen. Some spend their nights hauling freight over Asia, far from the country where they first took off. That is what happens to the roughly 120 abandoned Spirit planes. They did not vanish. They did not rot. They scattered across the entire world and quietly went back to work. It is easy to picture a dead airline as one final frozen image. All those yellow jets dark on the tarmac. The gates papered over, the people sent home, and that loss was real. The 17,000 jobs were real. The stranded families were real. But the planes themselves were never the ending anybody imagined. They were only ever between owners. So the next time you board an Airbus with fresh paint and a small scratch on the seatback tray in front of you, take a closer look. Run your hand along the cabin wall, and you might find a faint mark of faded yellow underneath. The seat you were sitting in could have carried a family on vacation last year for an airline that no longer exists. You will probably sit inside one of these planes one day and never know it. So, here's what I want to know from you. If you found out the plane you were sitting on used to be a Spirit jet pulled out of a boneyard, would that bother you at all? Or would you not care one bit as long as it got you home? Tell me down in the comments. And if you want to keep following stories like this one, the kind hiding in plain sight at 35,000 feet, subscribe and stick around because there is always another one.